So I don't have much time because I have to liberate myself to my next panel. So there are other worlds than this. I am a shameless Stephen King reader, and that comes from Stephen King and his 7-book tome. And so I'm fascinated by this idea that there are other worlds than this because I think it helps us expand our boundaries. And so my first point before I get into these other worlds is that I ask us to be earnest about liberation. I think it's very easy for us in this room to be cynical about liberation, as many of us have paid $300 a night to be in this room. But I also think that our cynicism about liberation this year, our cynicism about decolonization last year, our cynicism about anti-racism in 2020, I think that cynicism comes from a place of fear, but also from a place of it's much easier to crack jokes than to do the incredibly difficult work that anti-racism, decolonization, see, I can't even pronounce it. Liberation require. And so I think, and I hope that I can help us to start to do this work earnestly, both in terms of our academic work, but in our personal lives, in our lives when we go out of this hotel and interact with other human beings. Because as a historian, that is what I work on, human beings. And I try to remember that. For every person, every name I see in the archive is a person who has lived and who has died. And that person has had meaning to themselves and to other people. And I was struck by a comment that my colleague Nana Aseopari said yesterday in our panel about dispossession. And the opposite of dispossession is not possession, but it's mattering and unforgetting. And I think those two elements, mattering and unforgetting, go to the heart of what liberation is. At least to me in my work, and to me as a Black woman in the United States, to me as a Black woman in an overwhelmingly white field, and as a Black woman who's from Southeast Texas. Unforgetting and mattering are what we do as historians. Otherwise, why are we all in the archive? Oh, economic historians, I know, y'all are different. But that's why I do the work that I do. And so through my work, and particularly in my latest work I presented, it's been recovering, mattering the histories of Black women in Eastern Europe, in East Germany, and in the Soviet Union in particular. But on my panel yesterday, we heard about Afro-Turkish women. We heard about Black women in Serbia, Black women in Yugoslavia, Black women in Albania. And the other worlds than this, to me, means the importance of expanding our intellectual horizons within this field. So often, we are recreating the wheel when we don't have to. As Maria pointed out, we've had a lot of work done on decolonization by thinkers who often are not considered within the world of Slavic and Eastern European studies. But they should be, because they were looking at that picture from 44 to 46 of those European leaders. As Eastern Europe was assigned to Stalin, Southeast Asia and Africa were being reapplied and reassigned to many European countries. Puerto Rico was once again resigned to the United States. So we have a multiplicity of forms of oppression and colonialism and neocolonialism that I think connects many people of our field in Slavic and Eastern European studies to those in the global South. So in many ways, we have to realign our conceptualization of what it means to belong to the first, second, and third worlds. Very few people want to claim third worldship, but what does it mean if we think of Eastern Europe within the third world currently? How does that help us understand the current power structures that place Ukraine at the whim of a Congress in the United States who decides to pause weapons that were promised? So when I think of other worlds, when I think of the Black women that I'm trying to find in archives who do not see them, and why are they not seen? What does it mean to be a person, to have your history told? It can only be told in the archive, and the archive has decided you don't exist. These are questions that African American historians face writing about women who lived through slavery, but it's also a question I faced when I was in Odessa and looking at the Holodomor, and I was told many of those records were either taken by the Soviets or were burned by the Nazis. The erasures, the destruction of the material history that we have, the cultural history that we see in Eastern Europe, it is replicated, and it was replicated in the destruction of Africa, the destruction of Southeast Asia. There are many more things that connect us. Our field, the field of Africana studies, African history, Southeast Asian history, than divide us. Besides languages, because Russian is very difficult, Ukraine is very difficult, I think Arabic is probably difficult. But I think if we think differently about how we present ourselves, how many of you have gone to a conference that is in Slavic and Eastern European studies? Have gone to German studies, African studies, Southeast Asian studies? We create walls separating ourselves from scholars who are doing work very similar to ours. And I think there are a lot of benefits to this. Not only can we learn from them, but they can learn from us. And I think this comes to some of these problems and conflicts we have now, where people in the field can be so cynical about decolonization, because decolonization for Eastern Europeans may not look like or feel like what it does for people in Ghana or Kenya or Indonesia. However, we see now the real implications of when someone sees Russia as a liberating force. What happens and what does that mean when people buy into that history? Because of an ignorance of that history. But what happens for us when we ignore the history of European colonization in the second and third world? It has very real meaning when we say European values, because European values to a Ukrainian or to a German do not mean the same thing to a Namibian or a South African. And so when I think about my job as a historian, I try to build the bridges between these worlds, because to me, they're very similar. And I think we have a lot to learn from each other. But I also think that the cost of continuing to maintain these intellectual walls is entirely too high for the world. And I'll give you an example. I think that we forget the bonds of humanity. And recognition is an important part of that. The unforgetting is an important part of that. But as the second invasion of Ukraine started, I saw Afro-Ukrainians who couldn't get out of Ukraine to go into Poland because their blackness overshadowed their Ukrainianness. I saw Roma individuals who were beaten when they got into Hungary because their Roma overshadowed their Ukrainianness. There are very real life and death impacts of the walls that we create intellectually that go out into popular understandings of belonging. And so when I say there are other worlds, I want to emphasize something that I think many people in the world and the popular culture on Twitter, jitter, whatever we call it now, may not understand. But to me, it's very clear. When we talk about Russian aggression, we focus on Ukraine because it is the latest example of this genocidal violence. But I also want to impress upon you all that the fate of Ukraine is very much tied to the fate of the Central African Republic, where Prigozhin's goons are taking over minds and have done unspeakable crimes to people of Central African Republic, many of which we saw replicated in Ukraine. The types of violence we see against Black bodies in Africa done by Russians are similar to the violence we see in Ukraine. The fate of Ukraine, the fate of the Central African Republic, the fate of Syria, they're all tied together. And so what I ask for us to think about is not only are there other worlds than this, but what I'm proposing is that we reframe and retake the meaning of internationalism. Because we know Soviet internationalism often meant to cover up imperialism. But what does it mean if the people of Eastern Europe and the people of Africa and the people of Southeast Asia and the Black people of the United States, if we come together to form an internationalism that's multicultural, but also fluid, where we understand each other, we understand the various levels of oppression, and we work towards something greater. So there are, in fact, other worlds than this. And I ask you, in your work, in your lectures, in your teaching, in your syllabi, in your interactions on the Red Line, which is actually closed this weekend, that you remember humanity and you engage earnestly with liberation, meaning unforgetting, but also mattering. That you engage with other people through you matter. Because I think that's one of the most important things we can do as academics, and it gets really easy to forget when you're trying to compile an article or grade papers, is the thing that brought me to Soviet history, is the people. So I ask that you remember that you earnestly engage and that you explore the other worlds than this. Thank you.